You hear your name called from the darkness of a marble corridor. Your hands shake as you adjust your wife's stola one final time, smoothing fabric that will soon be torn away by hands that are not yours. She doesn't look at you. She hasn't looked at you in weeks. The guards are waiting. You've already paid the fee, 16,000 sesterces, carefully counted, officially recorded as a voluntary contribution to the divine treasury. The choice was simple. Bring her yourself, or watch your son's body return to you in pieces. So you walk. The marble is cold beneath your sandals, and somewhere in the distance you hear laughter. This was not a nightmare. This was policy. If you are watching this from anywhere in the world, drop a comment and let me know. It amazes me how a story buried in ancient Roman archives still speaks to something we recognize across centuries and continents. The man who designed this system took power in the year 37 CE as Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, though history remembers him by a childhood nickname, Caligula, Little Boots. He was 24 years old when the Roman Senate handed him absolute authority over the greatest empire the world had ever known. The crowds celebrated for 100 days. They scattered rose petals in his path. They believed the gods themselves had finally answered their prayers for a just and merciful ruler. Within 4 years, those same streets would run with blood, and the word mercy would become a sick joke whispered only in the darkest corners of the city. But the blood was just the surface. What Caligula built beneath it, a machine that turned human dignity into bureaucratic procedure, family bonds into financial transactions, and suffering into theater, that was the true horror. And the most terrifying part? It didn't crumble when he died. Parts of it survived, buried in legal precedent and cultural memory, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone ruthless enough to read the manual. The boy who would become a monster learned cruelty the way most children learn to read, slowly, through observation, until the lessons became second nature. Caligula spent his childhood among the Germanic legions where his father, Germanicus, was the most beloved general in Rome. Soldiers would hoist the boy onto their shoulders, dress him in miniature armor, and parade him through the camps. He learned to mimic their swagger, their jokes, their casual violence. He also learned that love could be weaponized. When Germanicus died, poisoned, most believed, on orders from Emperor Tiberius, Caligula watched his family destroyed piece by piece. His mother Agrippina was exiled and starved to death. His brothers were executed or imprisoned until madness claimed them. Caligula survived by becoming invisible, by playing the fool, by laughing at Tiberius's darkest jokes and never showing fear even as corpses piled up around him. Tiberius, the paranoid emperor who retreated to the island of Capri, taught Caligula a final lesson. Power doesn't require love or even respect. It only requires that people be too terrified to say no. When Caligula took the throne, Rome exhaled. He was young, charming, generous. He granted amnesty to political prisoners, reduced taxes, funded spectacular public games, and walked openly among his people. Senators who had lived in fear under Tiberius finally slept soundly. The empire had its golden prince. Then, 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell violently ill. For weeks he burned with fever so intense that court physicians recorded temperatures they'd never witnessed in a living patient. He convulsed, screamed, claimed he was wrestling with Jupiter himself in the realm of the gods. Rome held its breath. Priests slaughtered animals by the hundreds, begging the gods to spare their emperor. Some citizens even vowed to sacrifice their own lives if it meant Caligula would survive. He did survive. But something in him died during those fevered weeks, or perhaps something else crawled into the vacancy and made a home there. The first sign came quietly. Caligula ordered every statue of every god in Rome refitted with his own face, not as tribute, as replacement. Then he announced that he was no longer merely emperor. He was divine, a living god, and Rome itself was his temple. What followed wasn't random madness. It was systematic, calculated, and obscenely well documented. because Caligula didn't just commit atrocities. He built them into law, assigned them price tags, and filed them in the imperial archives like tax receipts. The first atrocity was also the most insidious: the transformation of Rome's aristocratic women into state property. Caligula began with his own sisters, Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Julia Livilla. Ancient sources, including the historian Suetonius and accounts preserved by Dio Cassius, record that he publicly engaged in incestuous relationships with all three, but his obsession with Drusilla went beyond even that transgression. He treated her as his empress, seating her beside him at state functions, lavishing her with honors reserved for imperial wives, and openly declaring that their bond transcended mortal law because they were both divine. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 CE, Caligula's grief manifested as tyranny. He declared a period of mourning so severe that laughter became a capital offense. Anyone seen enjoying a meal, taking a bath, or showing affection to their own family was executed for disrespecting the divine. The mourning wasn't love. It was rage at losing control over something he considered his possession. With Drusilla gone, Caligula's attention widened to encompass the wives and daughters of Rome's elite. He established what he called the imperial cult, a religious framework that justified what was, in practice, organized sexual exploitation on an unprecedented scale. Senatorial wives were summoned to the palace under the pretense of religious service. They were assigned schedules, given ceremonial garments of sheer silk that concealed nothing, and made to participate in rituals that would have been called rape in any other context. But Caligula had renamed rape as worship, violation as divine service, and resistance as heresy. The system had rules, written rules. There were protocols for everything: which women would be summoned on which nights, how long each ceremony would last, who would be permitted to observe, and, most chillingly, how much each act would cost. Because the second atrocity was the financialization of human suffering, Caligula didn't merely abuse his power, he monetized it. A senator who wanted to protect his wife from the imperial cult could pay for her absence. 16,000 sesterces kept her safe for a month. 2,000 more if she was beautiful. 5,000 if she was a virgin. Want to keep your daughter out of the breeding program? That's a separate fee, calculated based on her age and fertility. These weren't bribes paid under the table. They were official transactions, recorded in the imperial treasury with the same bureaucratic precision as tax revenue or military expenditures. Scribes maintained ledgers listing every woman's name, age, physical description, and the specific acts she was required to perform. Accountants tallied the revenue. Auditors ensured that senators paid on time. The machinery of the Roman state, the same apparatus that had built roads across continents and aqueducts that defied engineering logic, was repurposed to transform cruelty into a profitable government program. But Caligula understood something that made him more dangerous than a simple tyrant. He knew that the deepest humiliation wasn't physical. It was making people complicit in their own destruction. The third atrocity was the theater of forced participation. Caligula didn't just abuse senators' wives in private, he made it a spectacle. He converted sections of the imperial palace into what he called temples, each dedicated to a different god and each designed for a specific type of humiliation. The Chamber of Venus was where noble women were paired with gladiators and slaves in elaborately staged performances. The Hall of Priapus was reserved for the most degrading acts, ones Caligula believed stripped his victims of their humanity entirely, and the senators were required to attend. They sat in galleries wearing their purple-striped togas, symbols of their ancient dignity, and watched their wives degraded below them. Caligula observed from a golden throne, taking notes. He documented everything: who seemed eager, who hesitated, who tried to maintain composure. These notes became political weapons. A senator whose wife appeared too cooperative found himself under investigation for conspiracy. One whose wife resisted found his young son returned to him castrated, a warning against defiance. The message was clear. There was no safe response, no correct way to navigate the system. Everyone would be broken eventually. The only question was how. The fourth atrocity was the breeding program. This went beyond exploitation into something that resembled livestock management. Court physicians were ordered to examine women, wives, daughters, even young girls as young as 12, and assess their fertility. These examinations were conducted in front of Caligula himself, who asked invasive questions and made selections based on the physician's reports. Women deemed most fertile were compelled to conceive, and the resulting children were taken from their families and raised as imperial dependents. The goal, according to fragments preserved in the writings of Roman physician Scribonius Largus and later scholars, was to create a generation with no loyalty except to the throne, children who would grow up knowing the emperor as their only father. The pregnancies were recorded. The births were logged. Even the miscarriages and stillbirths were noted in the archives, along with speculation about whether they were natural or induced. Many women, facing forced conception, sought out abortifacients or attempted suicide, but Caligula had anticipated this. He stationed guards and physicians to prevent both, and women caught trying to harm themselves were punished with public humiliation designed to deter others from following their example. Some were forced to continue participating in the ceremonies even while visibly pregnant, their swelling bellies a testament to the emperor's power over their bodies. One case haunts the historical record more than others. Her name was Valeria, daughter of Senator Lucius Valerius. After months of repeated abuse, she stopped speaking entirely. Physicians examined her and confirmed her vocal cords were intact. She could speak. She simply chose not to. Her silence spread through the palace like a contagion. Other women stopped meeting her eyes because they saw in her something they feared would consume them too, the complete dissolution of self. Caligula found her silence amusing at first, then enraging when he realized he couldn't force sound from her throat. He eventually had her transferred to the breeding program, determined that even if he couldn't break her silence, he could still use her body. The fifth and perhaps most enduring atrocity was the administrative infrastructure itself. Caligula didn't invent cruelty. History had seen plenty of tyrants before him, but he industrialized it. He created departments, appointed administrators, established protocols, and filed paperwork. There were clerks whose sole job was maintaining the registers of women in the imperial cult. There were guards who escorted them according to strict schedules. There were physicians who examined them and midwives who attended forced births. There were accountants who calculated fees and enforcers who collected payments from families who tried to buy their way out. Hundreds of people participated in the machine, and that was the genius of it. No single person bore responsibility. The clerk just filed names. The guard just followed orders. The physician just conducted examinations. The accountant just recorded numbers. The system dispersed guilt so thoroughly that everyone could tell themselves they weren't really the ones doing harm. They were just small cogs in a larger mechanism. This diffusion of responsibility made resistance almost impossible because there was no single point to attack, no obvious villain except the emperor himself, and defying him meant certain death. Caligula even staged special events that turned atrocity into entertainment. On nights when the moon was full, he held what he called lunar fertility rites in a converted amphitheater. These were elaborately choreographed spectacles where noblewomen were paired with gladiators, foreign captives, sometimes even animals, lions, bears, trained dogs. Husbands sat in the audience, forced to watch, forbidden from showing emotion. Caligula orchestrated every detail, using a golden baton to indicate his selections and adjustments. The entire event was recorded by scribes who noted the participants, the duration, and any notable reactions. What played out wasn't chaos. It was theater, carefully directed, with suffering as the performance and power as the audience. The economy that grew around the palace was equally disturbing. Vendors sold ointments claimed to ease pain. Underground physicians offered secret abortions at exorbitant prices. Tutors taught young girls how to appear compliant to minimize violence. A whole shadow market emerged, and everyone took their cut. The cruelty didn't just corrupt the emperor and his victims, it corrupted Roman society itself, turning ordinary merchants and doctors into profiteers of suffering. Attempts at resistance were rare and almost always fatal. Some women poisoned themselves before they could be summoned. Others mutilated their faces with knives or acid, hoping to become too ugly to be useful. But imperial physicians became skilled at reviving suicide attempts and reconstructing damaged features. Caligula declared that beauty was irrelevant to divine service anyway, and he sometimes used scarred or disfigured women in his ceremonies specifically to make a point. No one was beyond his reach. Physical escape was equally impossible. The few families who tried to flee Rome were hunted down by informants and the Praetorian Guard. When they were dragged back, their punishment was designed to be so horrific that it deterred anyone else from attempting the same. Senator Cornelius learned this lesson at the highest cost. When summoned to deliver his wife Livia to the palace, he stood up in the Senate and publicly refused. It was an act of extraordinary courage and spectacular stupidity. The next morning, his 8-year-old son was found on the Senate steps, alive but mutilated, with a message carved into his flesh. Your father chose pride over your body. That afternoon, Cornelius personally escorted Livia to the emperor. When she became pregnant weeks later, Cornelius was forced to legally recognize the child as his heir, displacing his legitimate sons in the line of inheritance. The Senate then passed a law stating that any child fathered by the emperor outranked children born in lawful marriages. Humiliation was encoded into law. But systems built on cruelty carry the seeds of their own destruction, and Caligula's machine was no exception. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, were also embedded in his system. They were rewarded with access to victims, assigned to guard the ceremonies, and paid bonuses from the fees Caligula collected. One of these guards was Cassius Chaerea, a veteran officer whom Caligula mocked relentlessly. The mockery was petty. Jokes about Chaerea's high voice, orders to perform humiliating tasks during ceremonies, public insults about his manhood. But petty humiliations accumulate like drops of water on stone, and eventually they carve through. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula staged what was intended to be his grandest spectacle yet. An auction where senators' wives would be paired with gladiators in a competition of endurance, with the winners receiving cash prizes funded by the treasury. Numbers were called out. Bodies moved mechanically across the floor, exhausted into submission. It was theater, commerce, and cruelty fused into one grotesque event. The next day, as Caligula walked through an underground corridor toward the theater, Cassius Chaerea and a group of conspirators ambushed him. They stabbed him 30 times. Historical sources emphasize that one blow was deliberately aimed at his genitals, a symbolic reversal of the sexual violence he had inflicted. He died screaming in the darkness, his voice echoing off the marble walls that had once carried the screams of so many others. The conspirators didn't stop with Caligula. They murdered his wife Caesonia and smashed his infant daughter Julia Drusilla against a wall. They intended to erase the dynasty entirely, to kill not just the man, but the memory. The Senate declared damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. Statues were toppled, inscriptions were chiseled off monuments, coins bearing his face were melted down. Official Rome tried to forget. But institutions don't die as easily as men. The ledgers remained, hidden in palace archives. The children born through the breeding program grew up scattered across the empire, many never knowing their true origins. The women who survived carried their scars in silence, and the men who had participated, senators, guards, physicians, scribes, carried their guilt. Some tried to justify what they'd done. Others drank themselves into early graves. A few even wrote memoirs, though most of those texts were later destroyed by families desperate to bury the shame. The legal precedents Caligula established didn't vanish either. Future emperors studying the archives found blueprints for control, how to make cruelty systematic, how to profit from exploitation, how to make people complicit in their own oppression. Caligula hadn't just indulged in depravity. He'd written an instruction manual for institutionalized evil, and manuals, once written, are never truly erased. They wait in libraries and archives, ready to be discovered by anyone ruthless enough to use them. What survived longest wasn't the buildings or the laws. It was the silence. The children of the survivors learned never to ask certain questions. Families developed coded ways of speaking about the past, euphemisms that obscured what had really happened. Rome moved forward, built new temples, crowned new emperors, and pretended the machine had never existed. But late at night, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, the survivors remembered the marble corridors, the ceremonial silks, the sound of names being called from darkness. The corridors are empty now. The ceremonies ended. The ledgers were sealed away. But somewhere, in a climate-controlled vault beneath Rome, those records still exist. Names and dates and clinical descriptions of what power looks like when it stops pretending to be anything other than cruelty with a bureaucratic signature. They're just waiting for someone to open the files and start reading.